Welcome back. And this week what we're going to do is look at the second political revolution that really affected a good part of the world, and that was the French Revolution. And if you remember from last week, we spent quite a bit of time looking at the American Revolution and sort of the events that brought about the American Revolution. Of course, the most important one was the 7-Year War. And this is exactly the same case for the French Revolution. So if you remember, the French lost a good number of their colonies. So it lost the colonies in Canada, and it also lost its holdings in India. So they were really looking for money. And just like what the British ended up doing, the French tried to tax their people. And this led directly to the French Revolution. So the roots to the French Revolution are exactly the same as the roots of the American Revolution, but as we'll see, the outcome is going to be very different. All right, let's look at a few details before we actually get into the revolution itself. As you'll notice from the slide, French economy really increased during this particular period. So we're talking about between 1715 and 771. And as you can see here, the economy increased almost 8-fold. And what's really probably not all that surprising is if you compare England to France during this exact same period, England was number one in terms of having the strongest economy, and the French came in second. Now, you also find a very large jump in the population of France during this same period. So around 1700, you got about 19 million people, and in the early 1770s, you have somewhere between 22 and 24 million people. It's really hard to give specific numbers because we don't have an exact census. The problem, though, is that when you look at agriculture and the technology that the French were using, they were really backwards compared to England. So you've got a large rise in the number of people, and of course, when you get a rise like that, you'd expect to have the amount of food being grown to be more, because the more surplus you have, the more people you get. But this definitely wasn't the case. So France was in a little bit of problem, or some problems. And of course, mix in the 7-Year War, which we've already talked about. This really hurt them economically because, as I just mentioned, they lost their holdings in India and they lost their colonies in Canada and along the Mississippi. Then in the 1780s, they get hit again in terms of economy. The 1780s is right smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which France was not going through. So England was where the Industrial Revolution gets a start, and we'll look at this soon. And they were producing tons of cheap textiles. And so what ended up happening is that Britain flooded the market in France with cheap clothing. And the French people had a choice of buying expensive French clothing and cheap British clothing, and they chose the British version. So this didn't help their economy. And you also have a big increase in the number of people who are unemployed, especially in the large cities like Paris. And when you've got unemployed people, it's not like today where you've got unemployment insurance. If you don't have a job, you don't eat. So people were hungry. So all of this together is leading us up to the events that led to the French Revolution. Now, the way things worked in France is that the government tended to pay a lot of its own expenses. Now, of course, it's getting its money through taxes. But in general, that's how things work. So the government was run by the money that was really given to the French government by the monarch. Now, of course, remember we just talked about the 7-Year War, where France has lost quite a bit. France goes deeper and deeper into debt, and of course what this means is that the monarch doesn't have as much money as he or she normally would have to pay for the government. And when you've got problems like this, what governments tend to do is try and raise taxes, because that's one way to get more money. Now, before we get into the whole tax issue, I just want to talk a little bit about French society during this period. And there's quite a bit of debate about whether you can actually break these, break the French society up into these 3 estates. But in general, historians believe that there were 3 estates. So one is called the First Estate, and this was the church. And really here we're talking about the Catholic Church. The Second Estate, or the second social class, was all the nobility. So everyone from the lords to the vassals to the sub-vassals and so on. And then, of course, you get all the rest, and that is the third estate. When you look at population numbers, the third estate makes up about 97% of the entire French population, and the second estate and first estate make up the rest, which is about 3%. The biggest issue that led to the French Revolution is about taxes. And in general, when you look at French society in the 1700s, you find that people who are part of the first and second estate, so the church and the nobility, in general do not pay taxes. And the King of France during this period was Louis XVI. He really wanted to change this because, as I said, he is really hurting for money. So what he wanted to do was tax the first and second estate. So he couldn't just do this. So what he did was he called for an assembly, and this assembly was called the Assembly of Notables, and this met in 1787. What he wanted them to do is to say, yes, we will now pay taxes. And it was up to them, and what they ended up doing is rejecting this. So this Assembly of Notables didn't meet for very long. I mean, technically they met from February 1787 to May, and when they decided they weren't paying taxes, they just disbanded themselves. And what they essentially said is the poor people have been paying taxes in the past, and they should continue to pay them in the future. Just tax them more. So the Assembly of Notables met in 1787, and it just so happens that in 1788, France went through, and really Europe in general, went through a really horrible winter. And the man that came to the forefront as sort of helping to save France through this period was Jacques Necker. And he really becomes a hero to the people, and he'll play another small role in the French Revolution, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Anyway, what Necker ended up doing is making laws that stopped France from exporting grain. Now, as I mentioned, Europe was going through a pretty severe winter in 1788, and lots of countries needed food. And so for farmers, this is a great time to sell any extra and make quite a bit of money. But Necker stopped this, so France could not export grain. He also moved to import more, and of course lots of other countries were doing the exact same thing, and it didn't quite work. And this winter was extremely severe. In fact, severe enough that lots of the rivers that Europe was normally depending on for transport froze over. So it was really hurting in general. And of course, the king is still wanting money. So what he ends up doing is calling something called the Estate General. And as I put up here on the scene, you've got the first one meeting in 1614, or the last one meeting in 1614. He now calls one to meet in 1789 to discuss the issue of taxes. And what you're looking at here on the scene is a great political cartoon showing the third estate as an old man. And if you look closer, he's got a hoe because the third estate did all the agricultural work. And on his back, he is carrying the first estate, which is the person in the purple. And if you look closely, there's a cross. And then the second estate, which is the nobles. So they're all riding on the back of the third estate. So the Estate General meets in May of 1789. And again, the issue is who's going to pay the taxes. Now, what normally happens at these Estate General is that each estate gets 1/3 of the vote. So the first estate gets a third, second estate third, and the third estate gets a third. And what normally happens at these is that the first estate and the second estate team up and they vote together, so they get 2/3 of the entire votes, and the third estate gets 1/3. And now, as I pointed out a little bit earlier, the third estate makes up 97% of the entire population. And so what they did was they took a vote on who should pay taxes, and the first estate, second estate voted as a block. 2/3 of the vote said they didn't want to pay taxes and that the third estate should. No big surprise, the third estate rebelled. They pointed out that they made up 97% of the population and they deserve a much larger chunk of the vote. So what they ended up doing is breaking away from the government. And this is the first step in the French Revolution. So what they did was they created something called the National Assembly. And it's the first time that you've got, during this period, the French people challenging their king and those who make up the first and second estate. So the third estate breaks away, and what they end up doing is going into a building which was a tennis court. And they all got together and they vowed not to leave until they actually formed a new government. And they took an oath, and this is something called the Tennis Court Oath, and I've given you the date here on the scene, June 20th, 1789. And what's really nice about this is that some in the First Estate and in the Second Estate joined the Third Estate to try and form a new government. Now, of course, you still have the king, Louis XVI. He could have stopped this if he really wanted to. And what he ended up doing is sending in troops. And these troops just surrounded the tennis court, and for whatever reason, he decides to back away. So the people who are in the tennis court taking this oath not to leave until they form a government sees weakness in the French monarchy because Louis XVI did not attack them. News of the tennis court oath and the fact that the Third Estate separated itself during the Estate General spread fairly quickly, and in general the French people were very excited about this, and they took their excitement out in terms of riots. And one very famous riot that took place during this period is the storming of the Bastille. And the Bastille is, or was, a French prison. So a place where the government would put political prisoners. And what set this all off is the fact that Necker was replaced on June 12, 1789. And I had mentioned Necker earlier. He was the economic minister who really tried to save France in the horrible winter of 1788. He was replaced, and the people went into riot. And on the 14th, they stormed the Bastille, which of course is a holiday in France today. And if you ever live in an area that has a large French population, they always celebrate the 14th as the storming of the Bastille Day. So there weren't very many prisoners in Bastille during this period, but the people overtook it. They captured the main guard, chopped his head off, put his head on a pike, and then carried it through the streets. And what usually happens with rioting is that it leads to more rioting. And so these break out all over France. And the new government, called the National Assembly, which we talked about earlier, decided that they needed to do something about it. So they started talking about making a constitution and all the things that they wanted to change. So they started passing laws. And I've given you a fairly long list here. We don't need to go through all of these. But some of the more important ones is that these feudal privileges that the nobility had, they were going to get rid of them. So they got rid of the feudal privileges. You also have these nobles who forced people to work for them. So this is essentially the idea of serfs. So if the lord wanted a bridge built, he just told the poor people on his land that that's what they were going to do. And when they were finished, they were told what else to do. So that was gotten rid of as well. You also have the idea that these lords are judges and juries. So that was gotten rid of during this time. And of course, we're talking about the Third Estate, which is the mass of poor. And what they ended up doing is getting rid of these things called tithes. So you pay a tithe to a church. It's like a tax, really. That's essentially what a tithe is. And they decided that that was no longer going to be the case as well. So what they're trying to do is make their lives easier through all of these new laws. One of the most important documents to come out of the French Revolution was a document created by the National Assembly in August, and it's titled The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And what I'll do is I will give you a tag that will take you directly to this document so you can read the whole thing. And what I've done here is just highlighted a few things. And what you should be thinking of in your head is that this is a perfect example of an Enlightenment document, which talks about natural rights that people have. And you should also be thinking about how it compares to our Declaration of Independence. And I'll talk about that at the end of just going through a few of these. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen talks about the right to liberty, the right to property, the fact that people had a right to resist oppression, which of course is exactly what they were doing. Men were equal before the law, and there should be freedom concerning religion. So all of these things put together, again, it's a perfect example of an Enlightenment document. And if you've noticed, if you've read our Declaration of Independence, you'll see that there's a lot of similarities. And the reason for this is because Thomas Jefferson had a big hand in helping the French write this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. One thing to remember in all of this is that France still had its king. So Louis XVI was the king, And his queen was, I'm sure, someone that you've heard of, Marie Antoinette. So they were still ruling, they were still living in Versailles. And there's a very famous episode where a number of people got together, especially women, and marched from Paris to Versailles and essentially took over the building. And they were not in a very good mood. In fact, they went into Marie Antoinette's personal apartments trying to find her, claiming that they were going to kill her. And when they didn't find her, they tore up her bedroom. Anyway, the next day, so they leave Versailles. The next day they come back and they forcibly take the king and queen and the government to Paris, where they were supposedly easier to keep track of and to make sure that they were doing what the people wanted them to do. So by the middle end of 1791, the French finally have a constitution. And as you can see from this scene, it took quite a bit of power away from their king. So the king had no control over the army, no control over local governments. In the new parliament that was created, he couldn't even send representatives. And the French knew about the way that the Americans set up their government, which was, a House and a Senate, and they decided to set up just a single legislative house, where people were elected, judges were elected, and most people would be able to vote. Most men, I should say, would be able to vote if they had 3 days' worth of wages. And what you can also see in their constitution is that people were born with equal rights. And again, you should be thinking about the Enlightenment during this period, because this comes out in this Constitution of 1791. People had equal rights. They could say what they want to, write what they want to, think what they wanted to. They could practice their religion any way they wanted to. And this is really interesting because this is what the whole revolution was fought over. All people had to pay taxes based on what they were worth, so based on the amount of wealth. And what the National Assembly decided to do is their job was to create a constitution, and they felt like they'd done that. So what they did was they disbanded themselves, and the new parliament started. And this new parliament is called the Legislative Assembly. So you've got the National Assembly, it creates the Constitution, then you get the National Assembly created once the Constitution is created. So the French were pretty happy with themselves about the new government they had formed. And over time, what was starting to happen, though, is that the wealthy people, so the Second Estate, didn't like what was happening. So a lot of them ended up leaving and causing problems for the French. And so what this new French government did is started to turn on itself. And this is one of the bad things that happened during the French Revolution. And France also became paranoid about other countries, because other countries didn't like what was happening in France. They didn't like that they were taking power away from their king, and they were afraid this revolution would spread to other European countries. So what ended up happening is France became paranoid and then ended up declaring war on Belgium. And as I note here on this scene, it was held by Austria, and the French and the Austrians did not get along. Now, Prussia ended up joining this war. And one of the main reasons Prussia joined is because Prussia didn't like the way the French were treating their king. And they said if any harm came to King Louis XVI, Prussia would join the war. And they ended up doing that. Now, the French reacted pretty badly to all of this because they had an army, but it really wasn't a well-formed army. So what happened is they suspended the rights of man and citizen. This is that very important document that they created, and they reformed their government into the National Convention. So originally it was the National Assembly, then it went to the Legislative Assembly, and then during this war it switched names to the National Convention to deal with all of the new things that were happening and to form a new constitution that could deal with all of this. This war quickly spread through a good part of Europe. And as you can see from this scene, you've got the French controlling the Austrian Netherlands. You also have the French controlling Italy and pushing into Austrian-held territory in the south. So this war, as we'll talk about in just a bit, soon spreads all over. And of course, Louis XVI really was losing total control of what was happening in France. He tried to escape, and he was brought back into France, and he was put on trial. In his trial, he was found guilty of leaving the country and sort of was forced into abdication. And then the National Convention started discussing whether they should kill him. So what they did was they took a vote, and the majority voted to execute their king. And what you see on this scene is the image of a guillotine, which is probably the most famous image of the French Revolution. And you've got someone holding up the head of the king, showing the crowd that they just executed their king. Now, of course, news of this execution reaches other European countries, and the war that France was fighting soon spread to a much larger area. So there's now war in Europe, and this war involved a number of different countries. I've given you a partial list up at the top: Britain, Holland, Spain, and so on. And they all made alliances against France. Now, the United States stayed out of this. So I mentioned earlier that Thomas Jefferson was involved in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the U.S. was heavily tied with France, and it didn't want to get involved. The French also declared war on Britain and a number of these other countries. So I mentioned a bit earlier that France didn't have a well-formed army, and it wasn't that large. Now, the one thing the French did, which changes war in general, is that they started something called conscription. And what conscription is where you force people into the military. And all of a sudden, France had this massive military that they can use against all of these different countries. Now, on October 16th, 1793, they still had their queen, who was Marie Antoinette. And I didn't mention her background earlier, but she was an Austrian princess. So I had mentioned that the French hated the Austrians, and they really did not like her. And what they ended up doing is executing her as well. Now, this is where the whole French Revolution sort of implodes on itself, because the French started getting paranoid about other French. And this leads to a time period in French history called the Terror, where there are thousands of people who are being executed, mostly with a guillotine, and there's primary texts that talk about blood running in the streets and so on, where people are paranoid about who supports the revolution and who doesn't. Now, one person who comes to the fore of all this is Maximilien de Robespierre. And Robespierre was part of the Third Estate back during the tennis court oath period. So he rises up to be the head of the National Convention, and he is really the ringleader of this terror. So he's having lots of people killed under his own authority. And one day he walked into the National Convention, and he starts talking about how there are traitors within the convention itself. And of course, everyone knew what was going on with the guillotines and the mass executions. And so people were a little nervous about him and their own position. And the next day, Robespierre came into the National Convention, and a bunch of legislators tried to capture him. And this led to fighting in the street. And there's a story about him having part of his jaw blown off in a street fight. They end up capturing him. And no big surprise, they ended up putting Robespierre in the guillotine and chopping his head off, as well as a number of people who supported him. So the whole French government was essentially falling apart during this period. One of the most famous names of the French Revolution was Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, he started off as a general, and he was involved in all the fighting that was happening all over Europe, including North Africa, because we know that he took troops into Egypt and fought there until the British kicked them out. In 1799, you've got a coup, so the National Assembly was overthrown, mostly by Bonaparte and his two friends. And what they ended up doing is setting up a government called the Triumvirate. And if you're familiar with Roman history, you know this is what happened during the Roman Civil War periods of the 1st century BC. And Napoleon Bonaparte took the title of First Consul. But in reality, he had direct control. 1802, he takes total control of the government and becomes a consul for life. And then the French Revolution, at least this part of it, ends with Napoleon becoming emperor. So remember, the very beginning of the French Revolution, it was started over taxes. The Third Estate breaks away because they don't think it's all fair, and they're looking for a brand new government, one with a lot of freedom. In the end, the French Revolution ends up with an emperor. So totally the opposite of what happened in the United States. And here you have a very famous scene of Napoleon standing at the center and putting a crown on his own head. And you can see the Pope in the background. Now, usually what would happen with the crowning of an emperor is that the Pope would actually put the crown on, but Napoleon would have none of that, and he crowns himself emperor, and you can see his wife down at the bottom kneeling in front of him, and I believe her name is Justine. And I have to apologize, her name is actually Josephine, not Justine. So with Napoleon in charge, most of Europe is now in war. So if you look at this map closer, you can see that Spain is under their control, Italy is under their control, a good part of Austria is under their control, Northern Europe. And then Napoleon also makes an attack on Russia. And you can see the little red arrows up at the top right of your screen. He left in the summer, early fall, and made the same mistake that lots of other people did when attacking Russia, is that they attacked and then early winter came. Now the Russians also made it very difficult. So as Napoleon was taking his armies through Russia, the emperor during this time, Alexander, was doing a scorched earth policy. So he was burning all the crops and things that the French could have used to feed their army. And he makes it to Moscow, and big parts of Moscow had been put on fire as well, so there wasn't too much there, and it was getting cold. So Napoleon ends up turning his troops around and hightailing it back to French-controlled territory. And as he's leaving, no big surprise, the Russians start attacking his backside. So by the time he got back, there were a large number of troops that ended up being killed or frozen to death in this war. And this is really the beginning of the end for Napoleon. The U.S. also gets involved during this period, and it didn't declare war on France, but it ended up declaring war on Britain, and this is the very famous War of 1812. Now, one of the reasons why the U.S. declared war on Britain is that Britain put a blockade over all of Europe and the Mediterranean and said anyone who is trading with France or any of these other countries will become subject to being fought against by the English. So the U.S. declared war during this period. It's the first war that the U.S. had against its mother country. I've already mentioned the war with Russia. By 1814, most of the Allies had invaded France, and he abdicated, meaning he gave up his emperorship. And the European rulers sent him to Corsica, which is an island off of Italy, so he's sent into exile. Now, he soon escapes there, made his way back into Paris. Again, he's seen as a hero for the French people, and he rules for 100 days, called the 100-Day Rule, so pretty easy to remember. The Europeans captured him again, sent him off to St. Helena, which is an island in the Atlantic, and he dies in 1821. Now, during this period of where he is sent into exile his first time, and when he dies, Europe went into this big planning stage of trying to figure out what to do to prevent a country like France rising up again. And you find a couple of different groups forming during this period. So one is the conservatives, and we'll talk about this in a few lectures from now. But the conservatives in general wanted monarchy to stay firm in Europe because they believed that kings and queens kept things calm. So it would prevent some like France going into a revolution. Liberals, on the other hand, wanted a constitutional monarchy. So they wanted a balance of power between the monarch and a parliament. The nationalists, they're sort of a hard group to try and figure out during this period. They believe that the people should have the right to form their own governments and to essentially run themselves. Now, it's not quite democracy, but it's getting close. So now you've got the conservatives wanting monarchy, the liberals wanting constitutional monarchy, and the nationalists wanting people to run themselves.